Okay, ready? Okay. Well, good morning, and thanks for everyone being here. I also want to thank CPF for the opportunity to speak today. My presentation this morning, that, as Jonathan had mentioned, is focused on managing historic resource surveys from the city perspective, and to provide some insight about what that involves, and especially for the benefit of other city planners or people in the city who have not been involved with or managed citywide historic resource surveys. I will also particularly focus on my experiences in the city of Whittier in managing both citywide residential and non-residential historic resource surveys. So with that in mind, we'll move forward here with the first slide. Maybe. There we go. We'll start off with only about half of all LA and Orange County cities have surveyed their communities for historic resources. Now, this might be either citywide or as partial surveys. To give you some numbers, about 59% of all LA cities have surveyed their cities, again, it's citywide or in part, and only about 38% of Orange County cities have done any sort of survey, citywide survey or partial survey. The numbers for your interest on the top for LA County cities come from the LA Conservancy's report card, and the Orange County city number comes from our very own Krista Nichols with the Preserve Orange Counties on the board of directors with me. So thank you for that little bit of information, Krista. It's appreciated. Okay, so why aren't more cities doing historic resource surveys? What are their basic challenges? To start with, sometimes there's no mandates in the city's general plan or municipal code that requires the survey work. Politics is also another huge issue. Local politics plays a significant part because some city councils may have no political will to potentially upset their property owners and businesses with survey findings that they might disagree with or they believe will adversely impact their properties or businesses. As a rule of thumb, councils will generally not engage in voluntary activities where there is too much uncertainty or anticipated public opposition to avoid adverse political risk to themselves. And this is particularly relevant during an upcoming election cycle. Councils put stuff on hold and they take a step back and not willing to move forward with something like that. And in some instances, councils just don't conduct surveys because their constituencies aren't asking them to do it. They're not lobbying for that effort. In other instances, some cities believe that they have no need to do a survey because they're a newer community and don't have potential resources to be surveyed. This is what I call the new city syndrome. However, in some cases, resources do exist in these newer communities as they were developed prior to the city's incorporation, but the resources may be modest in nature and go unnoticed as cultural resources, particularly if they are not of any particular architectural interest. Sometimes city councils don't understand that surveys can be used to benefit the community and expedite the planning process. And I'll get into more detail on that in just a second. Cities also may view historic resource surveys as an unnecessary cost to the city, especially if they don't have the general fund revenue to pay for the survey, or they operate under very tight fiscal budget constraints. So it just is one more thing that they feel that they don't necessarily have to spend money on or see it as a very low priority. Sometimes cities refrain from doing surveys because they have too many other priorities on their work plan and believe, again, that there's no real compelling need to do a survey right away or in the immediate future. This is one of the more common reasons that cities don't survey. Another important one is that there's a lack of staff resources is also an issue because most community development departments, I can tell you, are often overburdened just with the routine work activities that they do. And they don't have dedicated preservation staff to manage doing historic resources or even managing historic resources in their community if they exist. To give you an example of how prevalent that is. In the LA and Orange County area alone, just a minority of city planners are dedicated to actively identifying and managing historic resources. In LA County, about only 23% of the cities have dedicated preservation planners, and in Orange County, it's only a mere 8% of the cities have dedicated preservation planners. So the lack of staff is certainly an issue, especially knowledgeable staff that's sensitive to historic resources. So how does a historic resource survey benefit a city? It does in several ways, and let me go through a few of them. First, surveys help answer broad questions about a city's architectural and cultural development, as evidenced by the built environment, to make better public policy decisions when balancing growth with a community's heritage and sense of place. Surveys also help facilitate planning efforts by helping prioritize a city's planning goals and objectives. It also provides a basis for a comprehensive planning approach to protect important aspects of the city's built environment while integrating new development within the community in a sensitive manner that respects the community's character. Surveys also help expedite development processing too. For example, by facilitating review under CEQA. If you know which resources are significant and which are not, it avoids having to complete individual historic resource evaluation for every building over 50 years old that is proposed to be demolished, or where there is significant physical change to it in order to determine whether or not it's a potential resource as part of a project under CEQA. So the survey details and findings actually saves the property owner time and money, as most evaluations require typically 30 to 60 days to do, and typically an individual evaluation will generally cost, for again sort of a typical survey or a evaluation, intensive level evaluation, typically cost about $4,500 to $6,500 to do. Adaptive reuse projects and new developments are also streamlined by surveys. As a rule, developers and investors like certainty of knowing what they can do with their property to avoid development delays. For them, time is money, and as soon as they can flip a property, they want to do it, and that's a significant concern for them. So if a city survey has already been completed, a developer will have a clear choice of either purchasing a non-eligible property and developing that, or to invest in a eligible building for rehabilitation or adaptive reuse, and have a clear understanding of how the resource retains integrity and what important character defining features must be preserved to get prompt city approval of the project. This saves the city and the developer time and money, and that's a real key advantage of doing a survey. Surveys can also facilitate opportunities for economic investment and growth. And I'll give you a few examples. Through the identification and designation of historic resources, cities can offer property owners Mills Act contracts to leverage private investment into historic resources. This in turn can help jumpstart and revitalize neighborhoods. Local historic districts might also be created out of surveys, which typically adds value to the properties that are within the historic district, and it provides stronger neighborhoods when districts are properly regulated through preservation guidelines. One thing I think that's often overlooked by cities is that surveys can lay the foundation for heritage tourism. Cities that don't promote heritage tourism, I think, are leaving money on the table in terms of economic growth or potential economic growth. Preservation economists such as Donovan Ripkema from Place Economics in Washington, D.C. Have studied this and have shown that heritage tourists actually stay longer and spend more money than other types of tourists. According to Ripkema, for every dollar that's spent by heritage tourists, about 93 cents is actually spent on food, gas, hotels, other goods and services within the area that they're visiting. So I guess in short, identifying and preserving history can be a moneymaker for businesses, can create jobs, and it can create sales tax revenue for a community. And then finally, I just want to point out that surveys can also help facilitate business attraction. This is because some businesses like being in unique buildings that distinguish themselves from their competition to create unique shopping experiences or dining experiences for their customers. And historic buildings help provide this opportunity. And I'll give you a great example. In the city of Whittier, we have a historic bowling alley that was originally designed by the firm of Daly Powers and DeRosa. They were very popular mid-century modern architects that specialized in googie buildings, particularly with bowling alleys. Anyway, the building was recently purchased, and the developer decided to recognize that it was an historic resource because it's already been identified. Decided to do the adaptive reuse to convert it into a 3-unit commercial building. One of the commercial tenants that really embraced the whole concept of being really embraced the concept of this historic building was Bevmo. And Bevmo so much embraced the historic sense of the building that not only do they have their staff wearing bowling shirts as part of their uniform attire, but they actually create a sort of a bowling theme within the Bevmo tenant space. So this was fantastic to see how businesses can really embrace historic preservation, and it demonstrates that how surveys finding historic buildings and creating laying the groundwork can really help facilitate business attraction to create these unique buildings through adaptive reuse to get businesses to come into your communities. So when should cities do surveys? And I would offer that really should be done as part of your general plan implementation. And this assumes that your general plan has some language in it identifying that it's important to the community to identify historic resources or protect historic resources. If you do a citywide survey from the city's perspective, it's important that you capture all the building structures and objects and potential cultural landscapes that are in your community. And you want to identify all of these properties that are at least 45 to 50 years old. After the survey is completed, you probably want to update that survey and capture other resources, maybe 9, 10, 12 years after the original survey, in order to capture a new generation of resources that were not 45, 50 years old when you did the previous survey. So you're constantly wanting to survey your built environment to capture new resources as they, if you will, come of age. Assuming you haven't done a citywide survey, you may also consider doing it as part of a large specific plan, or any specific plan, I guess, if that matter, of the existing built environment. Also, as part of a downtown revitalization effort, your downtowns generally are going to be where your older resources are going to potentially be, and these are the buildings and structures and objects that you want to identify before you start developing design guidelines and planning regulations for these areas. I think the key thing to remember is that surveys should be done prior to any land use policy decision that may significantly alter the built environment, so that historic resources can be identified and incorporated into a comprehensive land use planning strategy or strategies, and promote their preservation, adaptive reuse to preserve the city's unique sense of place and its community character through a continuum of time. While new development's not a bad thing, certainly support new development, it should be woven into and respect the important features of the city's built environment, so that new development is not incompatible or is insensitive to the existing built environment, or that sense of place or heritage that the community has and that the community identifies themselves with. Approaching the survey, I think every city needs to decide what's more valuable than when conducting a citywide survey, time or cost. In the Whittier case, budget constraints and politics resulted in the survey being broken up into a citywide residential and non-residential survey, and the cost or the budget for doing both of the surveys was spread out over several budget cycles, so that it wasn't there wasn't an immediate impact or a devastating impact on the city's budget. When cities conduct or commission historic resource surveys, these are three of the basic standards or guidelines that city planners should be aware of and actually make sure that they use. And just to go through them real quick, National Register Bulletin 24, which identifies the guidelines for surveys, National Register Bulletin 15, which is how to apply the National Register criteria to evaluate potential resources, and following the instructions for recording historical resources as put out by the by SHPO, or the California State Historic Preservation Office. Not only are these survey standards used and recommended by SHPO and by mainstream historic resource professionals in California, I think they can be considered as best professional practices in the event that your survey methodology or findings are ever challenged by somebody in the community. Hiring professionals for surveys. Traditionally, historians and architectural historians are selected to conduct historic resource surveys of the above ground built environment. While it might seem obvious to everybody that while this might seem obvious, these professionals are distinctive from archaeologists, architects, and historic architects. However, some planners that I've come across in my career, as well as preservation advocates, seem to get them confused in terms of what services that they are really ideally suited for to perform, particularly when conducting surveys. For example, it would not be my recommendation to hire an archaeologist to do a citywide survey identifying important architecturally significant buildings. They're not really trained for that. They might have some skills in that, but that's not really where their training is. It's really your architectural historians and historians who really should be doing your citywide surveys or any sort of survey of the above ground built environment. Managing the survey. When Whittier conducted both of its historic resource surveys, one of the things I thought and found very helpful was to develop an advisory subcommittee for the survey. So what I did is I went out and recruited a two-member subcommittee of our Historic Resources Commission. I also got folks from the local historical society, our library staff, our city's record staff, and building staff, and somebody from GIS. And the idea for doing this is really twofold. Not only does it help get buy-in and decisions that are made during the survey, but these folks particularly, and I should point out that that getting the buy-in was really prompted more toward the HRC subcommittee members, because these people are going to go back onto the main body of the Historic Resources Commission as you're going through your public hearing process. And it's nice to have advocates on the HRC that are going to support the findings and the methodology and the survey direction that was given to staff and the consultant as part of that process. But also the other important point, by having these other folks on the subcommittee or on the survey committee, was to help identify where there are helpful records that could be found and used for the consultant in order to help them research the context statement and identify and do research on individual properties as part of the survey. So this is really appreciated by the consultants, and these people are really know where the records are at, and even some of the subtle records that most people don't know about because that's what they're working with every day. So developing a subcommittee or advisory committee for the survey, I think, was really important and extremely helpful. Gathering resources in preparation for the survey. I think it's important to recognize that cities have more information than they realize, and that can be helpful in conducting a citywide survey. Here's just a list of some of the some things that should be considered or researched out or found in preparation for the survey, and they might include old zoning maps, general plan maps, old zoning codes, building permit records, aerial and photographic collections, city history and biographical books, city directories or phone books, city newspapers, or where archives can be found in city newspapers, prior historic resource evaluations or surveys, and also to have your GIS staff, if you have one, develop maps of the location and age of buildings and within the city, so you understand how many resources that are actually out there within the particular time context that you're looking to survey your city for. This is a really important tool because it really gives you a sense of the amount of time that it may take to actually do a survey. And so when your council, your commission asks, how long is this going to take? You can tell them, well, we've got 1,500 resources that fall between earliest Whittier in this case up to 1967, covering that 50-year span. And so it provides a nice tool for the consultants to understand where the buildings are at and where really to look for the resources as they begin their windshield survey or reconnaissance surveys. Prioritizing publicizing the survey efforts. During both historic resource surveys in Whittier, I reached out to a broad community to make sure that there was as much public awareness as possible about the survey, so that no one was surprised by it or what the city was doing. I was also looking for people that might be interested in providing information that could be useful and that could be useful for the survey. Some of the resources that I used in the city that I reached out to get people more involved, or hoping to get more involved and aware of the survey, was by putting information on our city's website or our local TV access channel, putting information in our libraries, notifying the Chamber of Commerce, doing a press release, informing our local historical organizations and conservancy, and to provide handouts for the survey team. And the last one, I think that our consultants found very helpful, because oftentimes that they would, while they were out in the field, people would come up to them and ask, what are you doing? And in today's world, you don't know if somebody is casing your house or not. So having a handout that explains what the survey is about on city letterhead, I think not only alleviates concerns, but it also allows the surveyors out in the field to be able to give them a handout that it's going to answer most of their questions, so that they can continue to doing what they're doing, and it's not too disruptive to the survey team. So survey realities, and I want to talk about this a little bit, because I think a lot of planners really don't fully understand what some of the limitations are for doing surveys that some of you might. Planners should realize that not everything is historic. Because you have 1,500 buildings that are potentially are going to be reviewed, does not mean that you're going to have 1,500 historic resources. In fact, only a very small percentage of properties surveyed will be identified as eligible through the survey evaluation. And to give you an example, in Whittier's case, only about 5% of our buildings, which represented about well, of the 5%, only 5% of the 2,500 property surveys were actually identified as being eligible, and this really amounted to about 113 buildings, structures, and objects citywide. So you're not going to get this massive number of buildings. It would be unusual to, not to saying it's not possible or it hasn't situations. Maybe you have historic districts that retain, or areas that retain tremendous integrity that might be part of a historic district, and you might get more resources um, uh, in that particular manner. But generally speaking, you're only going to get a small percentage of your all the resources that you survey as actually being eligible through survey evaluation. There are also survey limitations to be aware of too. Since surveys are taken from the public right of way, some buildings may be missed because they cannot be readily seen from the street due to a few factors, and here are just three of them. There might be dense landscaping in front of the property so that the survey evaluator can't see the building or fully assess its integrity while looking at the building. The building might have some weird built on some weird topography where the building's up high from the street, and you cannot see the building. And our surveyors are not to go onto private property. This was all strictly evaluations from the street or the sidewalk, so you could only see what you can see. And that obviously impacted the ability to determine whether or not these resources were eligible or not. Again, it's a survey limitation. They also might be some resources might be obstructed by other buildings that are built in front of it from the right of way. You know that the resources are there looking at aerial photographs, but when you go out there, either a combination of landscaping or other buildings being built in front of it obstruct your view of the building, so you really can't do a proper evaluation of the building, and it's something you're just going to have to come back in the future and reevaluate if that opportunity exists in the future, or things change with the property. I think it's also important for planners to understand that not every piece of historic documentation about every building that's surveyed will be uncovered. I think there's a perspective, or there's in the planning world, I think there's a perception that every building is going to have this fantastic amount of documentation about every building that's out there, and that's just not going to happen. So some properties might need to be resurveyed in the future if important new information is discovered that can change a building's original integrity determination. Realistically, though, surveys, and from city's perspective and my perspective and experience, realistically, the surveys really only find the low to middle hanging fruit in order to make the citywide surveys cost effective. It's just not cost effective to go and do an intensive level evaluation for 1,500 properties in your community. It's just not realistic, and planners should lower that expectation to realize that this is just kind of a low to middle hanging fruit type of survey. You're going to capture appropriate resources, and you're going to have lots of good information about the survey, but to expect that you're going to get information on every building with great detail is just not going to happen. It's not realistic because, frankly, it's just not cost effective. Surveys are also just a snapshot in time, and this is another important realization for city planners especially. And what this means is that once a building is identified as an eligible resource, it may not always be eligible in the future if inappropriate changes are allowed to occur to the building. Likewise, a property owner could make sensitive restoration changes to a building and actually improve its integrity to convey significance, making it potentially eligible as a resource in the future. So that's why that surveys really should be periodically updated to confirm prior survey valuation findings. Ideally, in the perfect world, you want to resurvey your properties and your surveys about every 5 years. But because of budget constraints and some of the other things that we talked about, why cities don't necessarily want to do surveys, 5 years may not be a realistic expectation, but it's at least you have a point of reference that to try to resurvey properties with. So, finished survey results. One of the things that I did as soon as we got the completed survey for both the residential and non-residential survey was to post it on the city's website. And this was really, again, to be open with the public so they could see exactly what the survey says, what it doesn't say, what information has been garnered by the survey, and to, of course, to elicit public input, questions, and feedback. This is really important so that staff has an understanding of what the community thinks, especially moving forward through the public hearing process. The other really important thing to do, and I'd highly recommend, is to provide public outreach meetings, especially for the people whose property has been identified as being potentially eligible by survey evaluation. And the reason for doing this is there's several reasons. First, it's a good community relations thing, but it also tries to explain the purpose of the survey. People don't have time necessarily to read, hundreds of pages of survey work. And so you want to sort of summarize it and explain to them what the purpose of the survey is, because some people it's going to freak them out. And they need to understand why the city has done the survey. Oftentimes, people and property owners sort of have this attitude that, the city is doing something secretive and, we're going to get to the bottom of it. But really, it's to try to explain it's a planning tool. And that's all it really is to help us make better decisions and understand the built environment and how we can respect the built environment through adaptive reuse and preservation of our historic resources. We also wanted to explain what the survey results actually mean to them. Property owners have a tremendous fear, and rightfully so, that somehow that designating their property as an eligible or a landmark survey or putting any other sort of overlay or regulation onto their property is somehow going to prevent them for enjoying the benefits of owning their property. And so we wanted to help them understand what Whittier's Historic Resource Ordinance says and try to dispel myths out there. A lot of people think that when you designate a property as eligible or you identify it as eligible or landmark it, that you're putting a glass case over the building and you can never do anything again. And to explain to them, we're not doing inverse condemnation. We're just simply identifying what's out there so that we have a better understanding of what the community is and what it's not. And again, what resources we have that benefit the entire community. We also wanted to explain how property owners can engage in the public process. If they're upset with the survey results, we need to make sure that they understand what the process is. A lot of people, the only interaction they'll ever have with government in their life is at the local level. And helping people understand what the city process is, what they need to do, how they prepare for that process. Not only do they appreciate it, but it gives them a greater sense of security that, look, staff in the city is not trying to work against me. They're being open and honest about what it is that they're doing, and they're going to be more apt to engage and not just sort of hunker down and lock down and not want to communicate with you. And so this was another good reason for doing these public outreach meetings. We actually did 2 outreach meetings for both surveys so that some people were not able to go to one, they can go to another. And we tried to do these outreach meetings after work, 6:30, 7 o'clock, so people had time to come home, not take time off of work, and go to these meetings if they chose to. So how did the question you're probably all asking yourselves is, how did the property owners whose properties were identified as eligible, how did they react to all of this? Did any of this have an impact on them? What do they think of the survey findings of their properties being eligible for landmark designation? Well, here's some results. The first group, the non-responsive, represented about, in the residential survey, represented about 49% of all the property owners whose properties were identified as being potentially eligible for at least local landmark designation. And that number was very close in the non-residential survey, being representing 54% of the property owners. And what's interesting is I was really quite surprised on how many non-responsive that we had. I wasn't expecting that about half of the people's that were had properties that were identified as eligible were not interested in communicating. You would think that people would have some interest in knowing what's going on, and in fact, I actually sent out a couple different letters with their survey results for their specific property to try to engage them in conversation, gave them my phone number, my email address to try to get feedback from these people. But these people are just like in the image, they're flatliners, they're just not interested. And it might be because of the fact they've got too much else going in their lives. That may be a realistic reason that they're not responsive, but we try to reach out because it's important that even if they're not responsive from a city's perspective, as long as you're reaching out and you're trying to contact people, they can't come back to you at a public hearing and say, no one ever told me. And so the best thing you can possibly do is over communicate with your non-responsives. Another group were the people that were unsure if their property was historic. These are the people that vacillated back and forth, and there was a lot of hand holding and a lot of questions that were asked. These people represented in the residential survey about 19.6%, and in the non-residential survey about 11.4%. And I should probably point out that the people weren't so much concerned about whether the property was really historic. It was what historic designation or eligibility for designation really means to them and their properties. That's really what their fundamental concern was. And so they were trying to make what they thought was the best decision for themselves in terms of whether or not they wanted to support the survey and the survey findings. Now, the next slide is the folks that were probably the most fun to deal with. These were the people that constantly told me, my property is not historic. I want you to remove me from that survey right away. I don't want to be on it. It's an unwanted encumbrance of my property. You're trying to take away my property rights. And going through all of the public outreach process, helping them trying to help them understand if they're willing to listen, what the survey was, what it wasn't, what our historic resource ordinance says, and to try to alleviate their fears and concerns, just sort of fell on deaf ears. But you try. And again, you want to reach out to all of these folks so that at the public hearing process, they can never say that they were not kept informed. And that's really key, because a survey like this can blow, from a planner or a city's perspective, can really blow up in your face if you don't manage the public out there correctly and treat them with respect and help them understand and give them information about what the survey is and what your code says and what it doesn't say, and help them understand why we're not taking away their property. In fact, I had many discussions with these folks that you can make changes to your property. We're just managing it differently. If the council decides to designate the property or determines it eligible or designate the property as a landmark, using the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation still allows you to make additions to your house, just the same way that that design guidelines that everyone accepts, I think generally today, or how guidelines are imposed upon property owners and businesses when they want to make changes or additions to their properties. So we're not taking away their property rights, but nonetheless, they have the opinion that they do. These people represented about almost 15% of the residential survey, and in the non-residential survey, about 13.8%. And then lastly, we have folks that felt that liked the fact that their property was historic. These people weren't necessarily actively engaged in the public hearing process or the public outreach process. I would get phone calls, or I might get a letter from time to time saying that they heard about the survey, they realized their property appears eligible, and they like it, and please landmark me. I think this is really cool to do. And so these people were easy, and they were very positive. They saw the survey as a very positive thing. One other quick thing to note was, of the 2,500 plus properties that we surveyed as part of the citywide residential and non-residential survey, I only got one person who proactively called me or even contacted me to tell me that the survey results for their property were wrong, because their property should have been designated as a historic resource or identified as a historic resource. that was the only exception that I had to that. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to them, about how the surveyors came up with the findings that they did. But a lot of people take a lot of pride in their houses, and they've researched and they've tried to do what they thought was right. But at the end of the day, that some of these properties may not necessarily have high artistic values to designate them as something architecturally significant. But there are people out there, and it's important that they understand too why their properties, which are their babies and their pride and joy, were not identified. From planner's perspective, you want to take a very neutral role and not try to influence anybody's opinion, because that will blow up in your face at a public hearing. Just don't do it. Not worth it. And I think it's just good professional practice as well. Oh, one other quick thing I think is important to point out. One of the things that we did as far as going through the public hearing process is the folks that were absolutely convinced that the properties weren't historic and didn't want to be part of the survey, we allowed them to go out and hire their own historic resource consultant, professional consultant, to do their own historic resource survey of their property to challenge the findings that our city's consultant did who made the determination that the properties appeared eligible. And all of these people, almost without exception, went out and did that. The importance of doing that and allowing people to do that, and we gave them about 6 to 9 months, if I recall, in order to come up with their own surveys. We even helped them identify who are the appropriate historic professionals to be going out and doing this here: historians, architectural historians, making sure they meet the Secretary of Interior's professional qualifications, et cetera. And in some instances, we actually got results back from their consultants that, not surprisingly, contradicted our consultants' findings, but they contradicted it because of the fact that they had closer access to the buildings than our consultants did by just taking the survey from the public right away. And so when it went through the commission and council, our consultant and city staff and the commissions and councils could look at the report and go, okay, that makes sense. There's new information that wasn't discovered as part of the survey. And again, this is part of your survey limitations. The survey takers are not necessarily going to be able to see everything by just doing surveys from the public right away, but that's the limitations that you do have in doing surveys. But going through that, allowing people to have that process to have a voice and to contradict why they feel that their property isn't historic. It may not be because they may have ulterior motives that they just don't want the property historic because they feel that they're not going to be able to do what they want to with their property. But in reality, it was really determining whether or not some of these buildings retained integrity. And that's sort of beyond their understanding or what they wanted to understand. But that was really the reason why we removed some of the properties that originally appeared eligible, because the new survey findings found information that wasn't readily available or visible to our consultants. And it also provided credibility for what we were trying to do, because we were trying to make it as fair and open and objective as possible for all property owners to understand how the survey is done and how the findings would be made. So lastly, and in conclusion, the one last suggestion I would make for any cities doing either a partial survey or doing a citywide survey is really strongly consider adopting your survey findings for your city survey. And this really provides a basis for a more integrated planning approach to protect, use, and manage historic resources in the community. And it also provides certainty to residents, investors, and developers in your city, as well as city staff. If city staff knows that a building is not eligible or is eligible, we can communicate to the property owner and explain what process that they need to go through. And so it provides certainty to staff, and that's much appreciated. And then lastly, and on the staff topic, it helps staff to expedite development and secret processing for new projects, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So that concludes my presentation. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Yes, sir. Oh.
Just for the people that are online. Through this survey, did you guys were able to establish any historic districts as opposed to designating individual properties?
Good question. In the non-residential survey, yeah, we did identify three potential districts, but going through the process to allow the property owners to question the survey findings, new information was discovered about the integrity of a couple of the districts that were being proposed. And these weren't multiple properties. This was just one large piece of property. It was about the size of a city block, and one of them was an industrial park. Another one was a large church facility. And because their survey was able to get historic resource consultant out there to actually look in great detail and see the buildings, be able to go inside of the buildings, et cetera, it was later determined that through the new findings and visual survey that those potential districts were no longer appeared eligible, so we removed them. So for the non-residential survey, there's one district that still appears eligible. For the residential survey, there was no districts that were found.
Thank you. Don, are there other reasons why a city would want to create a GIS map of the age and location of their buildings, other than for historic resource purposes?
Well, I'm not a GIS guy, but I can tell you that the GIS really provides a great summary of where things are at in your community. And most of it's taken, like for our survey, was taken from information from the LA County Assessor's Office that identified at least what their records identified as the age of the buildings, so that you knew and where their locations were based on the different types of zoning classifications that we had, so we could identify residential properties and non-residential properties. In fact, one of the important points to bring up that did cause confusion among residents is that there were buildings that were residential buildings originally, but were converted to commercial buildings, and we did not include on the residential survey. We did not include on the non-residential survey single-family homes that were converted into residential buildings, and that caused some confusion because people only look at the buildings as what they are today, not what they originally were intended for. And when you're doing a survey, you're looking at what the original intended building purpose was, in this case, residential or non-residential. But GIS can be used for many different purposes, for identifying different aspects of the city, everything from where particular land uses are located at, to maybe types of businesses that are in a community. It just really provides a nice general identification very quickly of what's out there, so planners can use it for specific plans or identifying compatibility issues with or similar uses that are proposed to be constructed throughout the space. It just really varies, but it's a really important tool for planners, is to have GIS systems and maps. I hope I answered your question. I kind of danced around it, but if I didn't, let me know.
Okay, and I had a question actually. I was wondering, there was an interesting difference between the residential and non-residential reactions. I noticed 2.9% of people said that they thought their non-residential property, or that they liked that their non-residential property was historic. And I'm wondering why the commercial or non-residential buildings had that kind of reaction, and what kind of explains that difference? You know,
I've looked at some of these numbers, and you know, this is by no means, should be assumed that every city is going to have the same results. This is just one case study or two case studies of a city and what our experiences were. The only thing I could possibly offer for the explain the non-residential survey is that the 2.8% really represents the fact that I think property owners of businesses are concerned about let me back up. With the non-residential survey, only 2.8% supporting having landmark designation. I think it just reflects the fact that most people that have businesses or properties with businesses on them are concerned about more regulation. And very few people in this particular survey did not have that fear. The residential survey, more people just seem to be more okay with the fact that their residential property was historic. Some of them thought that it would add value to their property. They liked that designation. They weren't using their property for business purposes, and so that might help explain some of the numbers. But it would be interesting to further drill down and to understand why people took a particular perspective on and what they felt was right for them in terms of the survey results. But it's not really possible to do just because it takes more time. And as we pointed out earlier, you've got nearly half the people in the survey that aren't even responsive. So getting something that's statistically significant, I think you have to look at a lot more cities, and those cities have to keep track of what their survey results were and actually have access to the people and interview them to really fully appreciate some of these results and what they really mean to the community and individuals, property owners.